Hi, my name's Cliff, if you haven't been to the channel before. Today we're going to talk about brushes, mainly Signwriting and Pinstripe brushes. Let me move my tea out of the way so I'm getting looks. Right, now when I left school I became an apprentice Signwriter, and since then we've gone on to airbrushing, pinstriping and a little bit more of the Signwriting. But a lot of the signs today are done in vinyl, which I absolutely hate. They have their place, but for me it doesn't have any feel or anything. But anyway, today we're just talking about brushes, because I've seen a lot of people who do pinstriping, and there's a few things they could probably would benefit them. Let's talk about the first thing, because I can ramble for hours. Let's talk about the first thing, brushes. Now, these are Signwriting brushes. They're like little chisels because they're square edge. These are quills because it's actually got a quill, and that's the newer type with a metal ferrule. Now, believe it or not, I've had this one since I started when I was 16 years of age. Now, I don't know, a lot of people, they sort of they wash their brushes out when they've been using a bit of thinners or white spirit and then put them away. So, for me, the trouble is when you do that, the paint in the ferrule that doesn't get washed out properly dries up, and eventually it will creep higher and higher and your brush becomes hard and not usable, and then you end up throwing it away. Well, these are quite expensive, so you want to look after them. And the thing is with a brush, whether it be a little pinstriping, little dagger type brush, they don't work when you buy them. As soon as you get them, you're very lucky if you get one that works, but normally you have to work them in and keep using them, soften them up and get them to be how you want them to be. So it's important, that's why we look after them. Right, tip one, and this is something I don't know people do, but this is what we've done ever since I've been an apprentice, and it's something I've learned, and it works because this brush now is about 40 years old and it still works, and it's still, there's no paint in there at all, and it's fine. So what we do is we get some grease, ordinary just common grease. We then mix it with a little bit of oil. Now I know a lot of the oils today are synthetic super oils which aren't really good for your fingers as much now, but if you buy just the ordinary old sort of oil, part synthetic, whatever, that will do. And what we do is we put some oil in with the grease and we thin it down. We just mix it up, and then we end up with something that's not quite oil, not quite grease. And then when we are finished, we've washed our brush out, and then we just wipe on a bit of tissue, and then we get some grease, we put it in, and we just work it into the brush and down into the ferrule or the quill, whatever. Give it a good little work in, minute, something, well not even that, 30 seconds, whatever. Just rub it in there, squish it down into the ferrule, and that is it. Put your brush away. The next time you come to use your brush, you wash it out in a bit of thinners, a bit of white spirit, and it's good to go. And that brush will never dry out. You won't get dirty bits of paint, dried paint, nothing coming out of that brush. And that works for everything. Many, many years ago, when you used to have coach painters, horse-drawn carriages, buses, everything was painted by hand. You'd have a big paintbrush, but at the end of the day, they never cleaned their brushes out. What they had was, they had a container, and it was full of linseed oil. And what they used to do, used to have a little hole in the end of the brush handle, drop the paint into the linseed oil, and that's where it would sit. And then come the next day, they would take it out, the linseed oil would mix in with the synthetic paint that they was using, and then they would carry on. That way the brush never got any dry bits of paint in it, which then obviously didn't come out on the surface that you was painting. But obviously now we don't tend to do things like everything's sprayed now, so that's not necessarily the case. But certainly for your brushes, a bit of grease, thin it down with oil. You don't want it too thick, because obviously the more you work your brush to get it in there, the more you're pulling at the hairs, and you don't want to pull all the hairs out of the brush. You want to keep it looking as good as long as possible. So just a mix, but give it a go, and that will keep your brushes perfect for as long as you want to keep them. Right, the other thing is, right, here we go. Okay. Right, two brushes. Okay. Ready? Right, the other thing is, now, whether you're using a Signwriting brush or lining, I generally sort of tend to line with these. I've tried these and I can't really get on with them. They're great, they hold a lot of paint, but I suppose I've been used to these for many years, and Signwriting brushes for me just seem to work better for lines rather than these. But anyway, that's down to user preference. But, tip, I've seen a lot of guys, when they're using a lining brush or dagger or everything, they have a little plastic cup like this. This is just for the rubbish at the moment, but they have a little plastic cup like this, bit of paint, and they dip it in and wipe it on the side, and then they would carry on lining. There's two things wrong, well, there's several things wrong with that. One is, the paint has to be the right consistency for you to do your pinstripe. The thing is, the moment you mix that paint up in there with a bit of thinners, it may be fine to start with, but now this is going off, it's drying, it's thickening up. So from the start to the end, obviously it's going to be a different consistency. Now, for Signwriting, you get a lot of Signwriters, they tend to work from a cup, and that generally seemed to sort of show that they were not a professionally trained Signwriter, they were maybe self-taught. There's two reasons why we don't use a cup. We use a palette. Now, the thing is with a palette, you have your paint and you have a little tiny dipper of thinner. Now, when we're Signwriting, if we're doing a straight letter, then we generally tend to mix the paint on the palette to a thicker consistency. That way it helps the brush keep a nice straight line, less likely to move. But when we're doing a round letter, say in a letter O, then we would mix the paint up on the palette and it would be a little bit thinner. This means the thinner it is, the faster we can get the brush round, and we can do a much easier shape than if we're doing a straight shape. So you're constantly mixing up the difference, the thickness of the paint, slightly different consistency all the time depending on what you're doing. And the same goes when you're doing pinstripe. And the other thing is, when you're using a little cup, you just put your brush in, you can't really organise the brush properly before you put it on your job. Where on a palette, you'd have your paint, you can constantly get your brush all nicely loaded up, spread it out, get the paint in there, you can move it around, and then you'd have it ready for when you come to do your pinstripe. And the same with all your Signwriting brush, dip it in, mix your paint up, get it on there, and you can really load, and you can get your brush. For Signwriting, we need to get it more like a chisel shape, and the same, you're dagging it, turn it around, just get it nicely organised, all the hairs are where you want them before you actually start. And that's something you can't really do using a plastic cup with your paint mixed in. It's much better to use a little palette or surface and thin the paint as and when you use it. And the other thing I've seen people doing, when we're Signwriting, we have a thing called a maul stick. Now, it can be any bit of wood, I mean this actually happens to be a blind man's stick, but it can be any type of stick, but we just have a little soft bit of cotton wrapped up in a bit of tape, normally just round the end. So what we can do is we can actually put it on, we can rest this on the work with our hand, and then we can actually then, it steadies our hand when we're doing very fine work, rather than you see people trying to get their hand over things and just trying to have a very shaky hand. It does help once you learn how to use one of these, and it makes it a lot easier, because obviously when you're Signwriting a vehicle, you cannot turn the vehicle upside down or on its side, because the customer will get very unhappy if we did that to his vehicle. And the same thing is when, not the pinstriping, if you're doing a petrol tank, you tend to turn it round, pick it up, upside down, whatever, to finish off your pinstripe. That's okay if it's a small piece of work you're dealing with, but if it's a motorcycle and it's all together, that's something you can't do. So you need to be able to work above, below, around, whatever the work is you're doing, and the maul stick does help. You ready? Okay, now obviously I was apprenticed for about 6 years, and it actually took me at least 3 years before they'd even let me actually Signwrite a vehicle. or before you was good enough to signwrite a vehicle. You may practice on beating up old vehicles that scaffolders used to have. It certainly would have been a new vehicle. So for about 3 years it was just practice, practice. You didn't get paid a lot of money. And the pet hate was phone numbers, because it had all the rounds which are more difficult than the straights, and that was something you practice all the time. And if you was able to do some work on a vehicle while your governor was working doing the rest of the vehicle, it'd be sat there doing a phone number over and over again, because it would never be very good. So that was your practice. So it took me at least 3 years, say, before I could actually do anything, and then 6 years before you could actually feel confident that you could do something. But this would be your normal pose. You'd have your work in front of you, your hand would be on the maul stick resting, and then you just mix your paints and so on. And that was how it generally, that's how it was. It's much easier. You can move your maul stick around, stand back, rest your hand, and obviously by the end of the day, your arm wasn't aching so much as well. But certainly when you're doing pinstriping, and you're actually working on the small panel here, it's so much easier. You could rest it on something, whether it be a desk and you work here, or it could be on the actual work itself. But certainly it's easy to rest your hand and you could just then do your little pinstripe. Rather than try and hover over, it's a lot easier. And obviously I'd like to say a big thank you to Chris Jalcroft, who actually taught me to signwrite all those years ago, who's now enjoying his life in sunny Australia. But yeah, I mean, obviously I learned a lot from Chris, and then obviously you never stop learning, so once you move on then you continue. Okay, what I'm going to do now, obviously it's not a general how to do something, this is really for people who are already doing the work and they know, but just a few bits to help them. Obviously you're thinking, oh, I've not done anything, whatever, but obviously if you follow us or you subscribe, whatever, look on our channel, you'll see some work that we've done, and what we'll do is now we'll just actually show you some bits and pieces of me doing some things and bits and pieces. You can have a look for yourself.